I had just come home from my pre-op appointment when my son called. Not to ask how it went, not to say he was thinking of me. He called because he needed to know if I could take the kids from Tuesday through Sunday. I sat down at the kitchen table, still in my coat, my purse still on my shoulder, and I stared at the wall for a long moment before I answered. I told him I couldn't. I told him gently, the way I always told him things, the way I had learned to tell him things over the years, because he had never responded well to directness. I said, "Sweetheart, I have my hip replacement on Wednesday. I'm not going to be able to stand up on my own for at least 2 weeks after that." The doctor was very clear. There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "Mom, it's just 2 kids. I am 66 years old. I have one hip that has been grinding bone on bone for the better part of 3 years, and a surgeon named Dr. Patton who told me at my last appointment that if I waited any longer, we'd be looking at a much more complicated procedure." I had been putting it off. I had been putting it off because my son's youngest was only 18 months, and my daughter-in-law, Claudine, had gone back to her job at the marketing firm, and the daycare near their house had a wait list, and somewhere along the way it had been decided, not by me, not out loud, not in any conversation I can point to, that I was the solution. I want to be careful here. I want to be fair. Because I love my grandchildren. I love them the way you love something that undoes you a little every time you look at it. My grandson Theo, he's 4 now, has a way of pressing his forehead against my cheek when he's tired, and I would do almost anything in the world for that feeling. The baby, her name is June, she laughs like she invented laughing. I am not telling this story because I resented being with them. I'm telling it because of what happened when I finally said I couldn't. My son's name is Alan. He is 38 years old, and he is the person I spent the better part of my adult life building my world around. I don't say that as a complaint. I say it as a fact, the way you state a fact about the weather or the distance between 2 cities. It was simply true. When his father left, Alan was 11, his sister Petra was 7. I became both things at once. I worked full-time as a bookkeeper for a dental group, and I was home every night for dinner. And I helped with homework, and I drove to soccer, and I held it together in the way that mothers hold things together, which is to say invisibly, which is to say at great cost. I remarried briefly in my late 40s. That's not important to the story except to say that it didn't last, and the financial recovery from it took longer than the marriage itself. And I mention it only because when Alan got married 6 years ago, I was not in a position to give him what I wanted to give him. I gave what I had. I gave $14,000 toward the wedding, money I had been saving slowly for years. I paid for the rehearsal dinner. I made myself useful in every way I could think of. And then when Theo came, and then when the daycare situation became a problem, I was useful again. For 2 years, I drove 40 minutes each way, 3 days a week, to their house. I arrived at 7 in the morning, and I left when Claudine got home, which was usually sometime between 5 and 6, and some days later. I fed Theo breakfast, and I took him to the park, and I read to him, and I put him down for naps, and I made sure there was something easy for dinner left in the fridge. When June came, I did the same thing for both of them. I did not charge them. I want to say that plainly. People ask sometimes. In the polite way people ask things they already know the answer to. And I always said no, of course not. They're my grandchildren. And I meant it. But I also need you to understand that I was 64 years old and I was doing the work of a full-time childcare provider, and my hip was getting worse, and I said nothing about any of that for a very long time. Last fall, I finally went back to the orthopedic surgeon. The x-ray looked bad enough that he scheduled me right away. We set the date for the 2nd Wednesday in March. I told Alan in January. I told him at Sunday dinner, sitting at my own kitchen table, and I thought I was giving him plenty of notice. I said the date. I explained what the recovery would look like. I said I would need to arrange a substitute for the days I normally watched the kids. I even offered to help them look for a temporary nanny. He nodded. He said, "Okay, Mom, we'll figure it out." I believed him. In February, Claudine mentioned that they were thinking about going to her sister's wedding in Savannah. Her sister Denise was getting married the second week of March, same week as my surgery. They were planning to drive down with both kids and make a long trip of it, 5 days or so. She mentioned this while we were standing in the kitchen, and I thought she was telling me as information. I said it sounded like a lovely time. A week later, Alan called and asked if I could take the kids while they were gone. I thought I had misheard him. I actually said, "I'm sorry." He said it again. He said it as if it were simple. As if my surgery were a minor inconvenience that could be rescheduled around a family road trip. He said Claudine really wanted to be there for her sister, and the kids would be too disruptive at the wedding, and they were hoping I could take them Thursday through Monday. I said, "Alan, my surgery is Wednesday." He said, "I know, but maybe you could ask the doctor to push it? Just by like a week. I've spent a lot of years smoothing things over. I have spent a lot of years absorbing what I should have reflected back, swallowing what I should have said out loud. I sat with this request for 3 days. I turned it over. I tried to find the version of it that made sense, the version where my son was simply overwhelmed and not thinking clearly, the version where he would realize on his own how unreasonable it was. He did not realize it on his own. When I called him back, I told him I was not going to postpone my surgery. I told him that I had been waiting on this procedure for nearly a year because I had been trying to be available for them and that I needed to stop waiting. I said it kindly. I said it without anger. I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Claudine called me the next morning. I had always gotten along well with Claudine, or I thought I had. We were not close in the way I had hoped we would be, but we were civil and warm, and I had always tried to show her that I was not one of those mothers-in-law who viewed her son's wife as competition. When she called, her voice was careful. It had that particular quality of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say. She said she understood I had the surgery coming up, but she felt I wasn't being flexible. She said her sister's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event. She said she hoped I could understand how important it was. I said I did understand. I said I hoped she could also understand that I was about to have a major joint replacement and would not be physically capable of lifting a toddler, let alone chasing a 4-year-old. She said, "Theo is very well behaved." I don't know why that was the thing that got to me. Not the earlier conversation, not the request to reschedule the surgery, not the implication that I was being inflexible. It was that sentence. As if the issue were his behavior. As if the issue were anything other than the fact that I would be coming home from a hospital with a new hip and strict instructions not to bear weight without assistance. I said, very quietly, "Claudine, I can't do this." The call ended shortly after. I did not hear from Alan for 11 days. During that time, I had my surgery. My neighbor Phyllis drove me to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours and drove me home and helped me get settled and brought me soup from the place on Elm Street that I love. Phyllis is 71 years old and has her own bad knee, and she was there. My son was not. I want to be very clear, he knew the date. I had told him in January. I had reminded him in February. His phone did not stop working. The first few days after the surgery, I was too focused on getting through them to feel much of anything. There was pain, and there was the strange work of learning to move differently. And there was the physical therapist who came to the house twice a week and pushed me harder than I expected. I was tired in a way that went all the way down. On the 4th day, I found something in the mailbox that I was not expecting. It was a card. The envelope was lumpy, and when I opened it, a small dried flower fell out. A purple one, very flat, the kind you pressed between the pages of a heavy book. Inside the card, in big, uneven letters that were clearly written by a child with help, it said, "Get better soon, Grandma. I saved this from the park. Love, Theo." There was a note below it, in someone else's handwriting. Not Claudine's, not Alan's. The return address was from Connecticut, Claudine's mother, Irene. I have met her twice. She had apparently helped Theo make the card and mailed it on his behalf. I held that card for a long time. I am not going to tell you it fixed anything. It didn't. But it reminded me that the story was not entirely the one I had been sitting with. There was a 4-year-old in that family who thought to press a flower for me. That was real. That mattered. Alan came over on the 11th day. He did not call first. I heard the knock, and I came slowly to the door with my walker. And I opened it, and he was standing there looking the way he had looked at 11 years old when he'd done something wrong. That particular arrangement of his face that I had catalogued over decades. He said he was sorry. He said it standing on the porch, before he even came inside. I let him in. I made us both tea, slowly, in the careful shuffling way I was moving those weeks. We sat at the kitchen table, and I let him talk, and he talked for a while, and some of what he said was good, and some of it still missed the point, and I accepted both of those things, what I said to him. And I want to get this right, because I have thought about it many times since. What I said was, I need you to understand that I am not a resource. I am your mother. Those are different things, and I need you to hold both of them in your mind at the same time. He was quiet for a while after that. Before he left, he asked if he could bring the kids by on Saturday, just to visit, nothing more than an hour. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Theo came in very carefully, the way someone had clearly coached him, and he touched my walker with one finger like it was something slightly magical. And then he climbed up next to me on the couch and pressed his forehead to my cheek and stayed there. June, who cannot yet say my name properly and calls me something that sounds like "mama" in a very serious tone, sat on the floor and stacked blocks and periodically held one up toward me as if presenting evidence. Claudine stayed for the whole hour. She didn't say much. But before she left, she turned in the doorway and said, "Thank you for always being here." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I still don't, entirely. I think she meant it. I think she also doesn't fully understand what the last 2 years cost me, and I think that is something we will have to work out slowly, over time, in the way that families work things out, imperfectly and with a lot left unspoken, and occasionally with small dried flowers pressed between the pages of a card. I did not reschedule my surgery. I did not pretend the 11 days didn't happen. I have started keeping, very quietly, a different kind of account of things. Not the financial kind. I have always kept those, but the other kind. The kind where you notice what gets reciprocated and what doesn't. Where you pay attention to the shape of things over time instead of case by case. I don't know yet what I'll do with what I notice. Maybe nothing, maybe something. But I am paying attention now in a way that I was not before, and I think that is worth something. My hip, for what it's worth, is better than it has been in years. I walked to the end of the block and back last Thursday, without the walker, just a cane. It was a gray morning, and the trees were just starting to get that blurry greenish look they get before the leaves actually come in, and I stood at the corner for a moment and just breathed. I have not taken a trip for myself in 9 years. I have been thinking about a place on the Oregon coast where a friend of mine from college goes every spring. She has been inviting me for years. Every year I have had a reason not to go. I haven't booked anything yet, but I've looked at the dates, and this time, when I think about going, I don't feel the pull to check first whether they'll need me. I just think about the water and the quiet, and how long it's been since I sat somewhere that was entirely mine. That's new. I'm still getting used to it, but I don't think I want to go back to the old way. Not entirely. Not the version where I was so available that my availability stopped being something anyone thought to be grateful for because it had simply become the expectation, the given, the assumed fact of my existence in their lives. I was there. I was always there. I drove 40 minutes in the snow. I showed up when they called. I stayed late when they needed. I wrote the check when there was a check to write. I am still here. I am still their grandmother, their mother, the woman who will get up from a chair with a cane to open the door when they knock. But I am also the woman who pressed flower saved from the park by a 4-year-old boy who thought of me when no one told him to. I think that might be enough to build something new from. I think it might have to be. I've been thinking about cause and effect lately. Not in any grand or complicated way. Just the quiet, honest kind of thinking you do when you're moving slowly through a house with a cane and you have nothing but time to look at things clearly. What happened with Alan didn't come out of nowhere. I can see that now. It grew the way most things grow. Gradually, in conditions I helped create. Every time I showed up without being asked. Every time I stayed late without mentioning that I was tired. Every time I wrote a check and said, "Don't worry about it," when the truth was that I was worrying about it, just silently, alone. I was teaching people how to treat me. And I was teaching them that I had no edges, no limits, no point at which I would finally say, "This is too much." That's not martyrdom. That's not even generosity, not really. Genuine generosity has a person behind it who is choosing. What I was doing was closer to disappearing, making myself so useful, so available, so uncomplaining that I stopped being a full person in their minds and became something more like infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't need rest. Infrastructure doesn't schedule surgery. And then it does. And then everyone is surprised. I don't say this to be hard on myself. I say it because I think it's true, and I think the truth of it matters. Alan is not a villain. Claudine is not a villain. They are people who had never been given reason to question the assumptions they'd built their lives around, and so they didn't question them. That's not entirely their fault. Some of it is mine. But here is what I also know. Theo pressed a flower for me without being asked. A 4-year-old boy in the middle of all of it thought to save something small and beautiful and send it to his grandmother in the hospital. Nobody told him to do that. That came from somewhere inside him that is still forming, still soft, still capable of growing in whatever direction it gets pointed. That's the part that gives me something. Not the apology from Alan, though I needed that too. Not Claudine's careful thank you in the doorway, though I heard it. It's Theo, who is 4, and who already understands something essential about what it means to notice another person. The kind of person you become is built slowly, out of thousands of small decisions that mostly feel like nothing at the time. Whether to make the card, whether to press the flower, whether to pick up the phone, whether to reschedule. Those decisions accumulate into character, the way water accumulates into rivers. You don't notice it happening until you look back and see the shape of things. I want to be someone who makes the card. I want to be someone who presses the flower and mails it even when no one tells me to. And I want to be someone who, at 66, with a new hip and a cane and a very slow walk to the end of the block, finally understands that I am allowed to also be the one who receives it. I have looked at the dates for Oregon 3 times this week. I haven't booked it yet, but I will. Not because I've stopped loving my family, but because I've stopped loving my family, but because I've started, slowly and a little awkwardly, to include myself in the category of people I love. That's harder than it sounds, but I think it might be the most important thing I've learned from all of this.